The farmer who killed 500 men without a scope, Finland's White Death. The glint appears for exactly 1/10 of a second. It's a tiny spark of light, no bigger than a pinprick, cutting through the gray Finnish forest like a lighthouse beam in fog. Most men would miss it. Most men would blink and it would be gone. But Simo Häyhä has been staring at that pile of logs for 6 hours without moving, and he sees everything. The temperature is 45 degrees below zero. At this temperature, your eyelashes freeze together when you blink. Your breath turns to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. The forest around you is so cold that trees explode in the night, the sap freezing and expanding until the trunks crack like gunshots. Simo is buried in a snowdrift. You couldn't see him if you were standing 10 feet away. He's wearing so many layers of white wool that he looks like a pile of laundry someone forgot in the woods. His face is pressed so hard into the stock of his rifle that his cheek is gone numb. He hasn't eaten in 12 hours. He hasn't moved in 6. His body is screaming at him to shift position, to stretch, to do anything to relieve the agony of frozen joints and cramping muscles. He ignores it because that glint, that tiny momentary flash of reflected sunlight, just told him exactly where the Soviet sniper is hiding. The man who's been hunting him for 3 days. The specialist sent from Moscow with orders to kill the White Death and return with proof. The Soviet sniper has the best equipment the Red Army can provide. A precision-tuned Mosin-Nagant topped with a high-power PU scope. Custom camouflage. A spotter. Training from the best sniper schools in the Soviet Union. Simo has none of that. His rifle has no scope. Just simple iron sights, a metal post at the front, a notched rear sight. The kind of basic equipment that officers laugh at. The kind of setup that gets you called the blind marksman by men who think technology wins wars. But that scope, that beautiful, expensive piece of precision glass, just caught the sun. And in doing so, it became a mirror, a flag, a target painted on the sniper's forehead. Simo doesn't rush. Rushing creates tension. Tension ruins aim. He slowly, incrementally adjusts his elbows. He aligns the simple iron post with the spot where the light flashed. The distance is 450 yards. The bullet will drop roughly 30 inches at that range. He raises the front post slightly. He trusts the rifle. He trusts the cold steel. He trusts his eyes. He squeezes the trigger. The shot breaks the silence like a whip crack. Downrange, the glint vanishes. The Soviet sniper, hit in the face by a bullet he never saw coming, slumps backward into his hole. The duel is over. The man with the peasant rifle just beat the man with a precision instrument. And this isn't even close to being Simo's most impressive kill of the day. This is December 1939. This is the Winter War. This is the story of how one short farmer with a rifle that looked like museum junk became the deadliest sniper in human history. And if you think you know how this ends, you're wrong. Because the craziest part isn't how many men he killed. It's what happened to him on the day the war ended. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to the morning when the world ended. When the horizon turned black with smoke and the ground started shaking. When 1 million Soviet soldiers marched into Finland and everyone, every expert, every general, every analyst in every capital in Europe agreed on one simple fact. Finland was going to die. The date is December 7th, 1939. The place is the Kala River, a frozen waterway in eastern Finland that most people had never heard of and would never forget. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. In this kind of cold, the air doesn't just feel chilly, it feels like a solid object. It burns your lungs with every breath. It turns the moisture in your nose to ice instantly. Simo Häyhä is lying in a snowdrift, watching the horizon. He's 5 foot 3 inches tall. He weighs maybe 130 pounds, soaking wet. He's a quiet, unassuming farmer who's spent his entire life in the deep woods, hunting moose and foxes. There are no medals on his chest, no officer's bars on his collar. To the commanders organizing the desperate defense of the Kala line, Simo is just another reservist, a body to throw in front of the tanks to buy a few minutes of time. The Finnish army is outnumbered 100 to 1 in some sectors. They're running out of ammunition. They're running out of food. They're running out of time. The math is brutal and simple. The Soviet Union has invaded with 1 million men, 6,000 tanks, and enough artillery to level every city in Finland. They're the Red Steamroller, a military machine designed to crush resistance through pure weight and volume. Finland has 32,000 soldiers, 30 tanks, and a prayer. Every military expert in the world has already written Finland's obituary. The Soviets will be in Helsinki in 2 weeks. Maybe less. This isn't even going to be a war. It's going to be an execution. But the most controversial thing about Simo isn't his height or his background. It's his rifle. He's carrying a Mosin-Nagant M28/30, standard issue infantry weapon, a heavy bolt-action rifle that's been around for decades. Rugged, reliable, essentially a peasant's gun. But in the hands of a designated sniper, it's missing one critical component. It doesn't have a scope. The rifle is naked. Just iron sights. To the modern military mind, this is insanity. A sniper without a scope is like a pilot without instruments. It's a contradiction in terms. The entire doctrine of sniping is built around the idea of seeing the enemy before he sees you, reaching out and touching a target at distances where the naked eye sees only a blur. The officers in Simo's company tried to fix him when he first arrived at the front. They offered him a newer rifle. They offered him powerful optics that would magnify the target 4 times over. They told him that with a scope, he could hit a Russian officer at 800 yards. See the buttons on his uniform, the expression on his face. They explained, with the patient condescension that experts always use with amateurs, that the human eye was the weak link. That trying to fight a modern war with iron sights was like trying to fight a tank with a bow and arrow. It was primitive. It was stupid. They laughed at his stubborn refusal. They called him the blind marksman. They joked that he was too simple to understand how to use the glass. This mockery was rooted in the arrogance of technology. The 20th century was the age of the machine. Armies were falling in love with gadgets. They believed that superior engineering won battles. Bigger tank wins. Faster plane wins. Better scope wins. It was video game logic applied to a blood-and-mud reality. The officers looked at Simo's iron sights and saw a handicap. They saw a man limiting himself, a man bringing a knife to a gunfight. They didn't understand that Simo wasn't rejecting technology because he was stupid. He was rejecting it because he was a hunter. And in the hunting grounds of the frozen forest, a scope wasn't a tool. It was a death sentence. Simo knew things the manual didn't write down. Things learned from years of stalking moose through deep snow. Things that couldn't be taught in a classroom or a training range. He knew that a scope is a piece of glass, and glass reflects light. Even in the dim winter sun of Finland, a curved lens can catch a stray beam of light and flash like a mirror. That glint is the most dangerous thing on a battlefield. It's a lighthouse beam that screams, "I am here," to every enemy soldier looking in your direction. A Soviet counter-sniper doesn't need to see your body. He just needs to see that 1 second of reflected light to put a high-explosive bullet into your skull. Iron sights don't glint. They're matte steel, dark and dull. They absorb light. They're invisible. He also knew about the silhouette. To use a scope, a shooter has to raise his head. You have to lift your cheek off the stock to align your eye with a glass tube sitting on top of the rifle. It might only be 2 or 3 inches. But in a sniper duel, 2 inches is the difference between life and death. Those 2 inches mean your head is sticking up higher out of the snowdrift. Your silhouette is larger, a bigger black shape against the white background. With iron sights, Simo could bury his face into the stock, press his cheek weld so tight that his hat was practically scraping the barrel, stay low, almost flat, presenting a target no bigger than a grapefruit to the enemy. And then there was the cold. The experts in the warm command tents didn't think about what happens to glass at 40 below zero. If you breathe on a scope in those conditions, it fogs up instantly. The moisture turns to frost, blinding you at the critical moment. You have to constantly wipe it, clean it, baby it. Simo didn't have time to baby a piece of glass. He was going to be lying in a snowbank for 12 hours a day, motionless, freezing, waiting for a target. Iron sights never fog. They never crack. They never lose their zero because you bumped them against a tree. They're as hard and unforgiving as the winter itself. But the mockery continued. The other soldiers, terrified of the massive Soviet army gathering across the river, looked at Simo's gear with skepticism. They saw the White Death not as a savior, but as an eccentric. They whispered that he was going to get himself killed in the first hour. They asked why command was wasting ammunition on a guy who couldn't even see the enemy properly. They were looking for a high-tech hero, a man with a super weapon who could turn the tide. Instead, they got a short farmer with a gun that looked like it belonged in a museum. Simo ignored them. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain the physics of light reflection or the biology of survival to men who'd never hunted a wolf in winter. He just cleaned his rifle, wiped the cosmoline grease off the bolt, checked the action, feeling the smooth mechanical click of the steel, loaded the stripper clips, 5 rounds of 7.62 x 53 mmR ammunition at a time. He wasn't fighting for their approval. He was fighting for his land. The Soviets were coming to take his farm, his home, his country. They were bringing a machine of war that was loud, heavy, and blind. Simo was going to be the needle that broke the machine. On the morning of the battle, Simo moved into position before the sun came up. He didn't dig a foxhole. Digging leaves a pile of fresh, dark dirt that stands out against white snow like a bullseye. Instead, he slid into an existing snowdrift, packing the snow down with his body until he was part of the landscape. He was wearing so many layers of wool and white cotton that he looked shapeless. He pulled his white hood up over his head, wrapped white medical tape around the barrel of his rifle, breaking up the straight lines of the steel. When he stopped moving, he simply ceased to exist. He wasn't a soldier hiding in the snow. He was the snow. The Soviet attack began with a roar that shook pine needles off the trees. The artillery barrage was relentless, churning the earth, smashing trees into splinters. Then came the tanks. T-26 light tanks, their tracks squealing, rolled across the frozen river. Behind them came the infantry, wave after wave of Soviet soldiers in brown uniforms, moving like a dark oil spill across the white ice. They were confident. They'd been told the Finnish resistance was weak. They'd been told they'd be in Helsinki in 2 weeks. They marched with rifles slung, smoking cigarettes, laughing, expecting a walkover. They didn't see the tiny, imperceptible shape in the snowdrift 300 yards away. They didn't see the iron sights lining up. They didn't see the finger tightening on the trigger. They were looking for the glint of a scope. They were looking for a muzzle flash. But Simo had a trick for that too. He'd packed a mound of dense snow right in front of his barrel and poured water on it, freezing it into a hard sheet of ice. When he fired, the muzzle blast wouldn't kick up a cloud of loose snow. There would be no puff of white dust to give him away. He'd erased every signature, every clue, every trace of his existence. Simo took a breath. He didn't exhale. If he exhaled, the steam would rise in the cold air, a white flag signaling his position. He swallowed snow in his mouth to cool his breath, to kill the steam before it could leave his lips. He was suffering, freezing, cramping, but his hand was steady as a rock. He lined up the front post of the iron sight with the chest of a Soviet officer who was waving his men forward. The officer was wearing a long coat and a peaked cap, looking important, looking safe. He thought he was out of range of a standard rifle. He thought he was safe from everything except a scope sniper. And he couldn't see a scope. Simo squeezed. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The sound was swallowed by the vastness of the forest. 300 yards away, the Soviet officer simply dropped. He didn't spin. He didn't cry out. He just collapsed into the snow as if his strings had been cut. The soldiers around him froze. They looked around wildly, scanning the tree line. They saw nothing. No flash, no smoke, no glint. Just the silent white woods and their dead commander. The doubt in the Finnish trenches was about to be replaced by belief. And the arrogance of the Soviet invaders was about to be replaced by terror they couldn't name. The iron sight hunt had begun. The silence that followed Simo's first kill was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of confusion. The Soviet soldiers on the frozen river didn't know they were being hunted. They thought their officer had suffered a heart attack, maybe been hit by a stray bullet from miles away. They didn't dive for cover immediately because there was no crack of a rifle, no muzzle flash, no visible enemy. This delay was the deadliest weapon in Simo's arsenal. When a soldier hears a loud bang or sees a puff of smoke, instinct takes over. He drops, crawls, survives. But when a man just falls over in the snow with no explanation, the brain pauses. It tries to solve the puzzle. And in that pause, Simo worked the bolt of his Mosin Nagant. The steel handle clicked up and back, ejecting the spent casing into the snow, shoving a fresh round into the chamber. The movement was so small, so contained within his snowdrift, that it was invisible from 50 yards away, let alone 300. Simo lined up his second shot. This time he chose a machine gunner struggling to set up his heavy weapon on a sled. The gunner was cursing the cold, his breath pluming in the air like a steam engine. He was a beacon of life in a dead landscape. Simo didn't need to calculate windage or elevation with complex mathematical formulas. He'd hunted in these woods since he was a child. He knew how the wind curled around pine trees. He knew how cold air made bullets drop faster than in summer. He felt the shot more than he calculated it. He aligned the simple iron post with the gunner's chest and squeezed. The gunner collapsed over his weapon. Again, silence. Again, no flash. Now the panic set in. The Soviet line began to ripple with fear. Men started shouting, pointing at trees, firing wildly into the forest. They were shooting at ghosts, shadows, everything except the small mound of white snow that was slowly deleting them one by one. This was the beginning of the White Death legend. But the legend wasn't built on magic. It was built on a set of survival tactics so grueling, so physically painful, that no ordinary soldier could endure them. The experts who mocked Simo's iron sights didn't understand that the rifle was only 10% of the equation. The other 90% was the ability to suffer. Simo didn't just lie in the snow. He became the snow. He invented protocols that would become the Bible of winter warfare, but at the time they just looked like madness. The first problem was breath. At 40 degrees below zero, a human being is a walking fog machine. Every time you exhale, a cloud of white steam rises into the air. If you're hiding in a snowbank, that steam is a flag marking your position perfectly. It rises above your head, pointing an arrow right at your face. A scoped sniper has to keep his head up, which means his breath floats high. Simo, buried deep behind his rifle, came up with a solution that was brutal in its simplicity. He ate snow. Before he took a shot, he would scoop a handful of ice into his mouth and hold it there. The pain was excruciating. It numbed his tongue, froze his gums, sent a headache spiking through his skull. But it cooled his mouth down to the temperature of the air. When he breathed out, there was no steam, no cloth. He was a dragon that had learned to swallow its own smoke. The second problem was the muzzle blast. When a high-powered rifle fires, the explosion of gas leaving the barrel hits the ground with tremendous force. If that ground is covered in loose, powdery snow, which the Finnish forests were, the blast kicks up a massive white dust cloud. It looks like a miniature snowstorm erupting from the ground. That cloud lingers for seconds, blinding the shooter and showing the enemy exactly where the shot came from. The experts solved this by shooting from elevated positions or behind logs. Simo solved it with water. Before he settled into position, Simo would crawl out to the spot directly in front of his rifle barrel. He would pack the snow down until it was hard and flat. Then he would take water from his canteen and pour it over the snow. In the sub-zero temperatures, the water froze instantly, turning the patch of snow into a sheet of solid ice. Ice doesn't fly. When the muzzle blast hit that ice sheet, it slid off. There was no dust, no cloth. The shot was perfectly clean. It was a level of preparation that took precious energy and time. But Simo knew that laziness was fatal. He was fighting an army of 1,000,000 men. If he gave him one clue, one single puff of snow, he was dead. The third problem was the silhouette. This was where iron sights proved their superiority over expensive glass scopes. To look through a scope, a sniper has to raise his head to align his eye with the lens. It creates a turret effect. The head pops up, creating a dark shape against the white background. Simo didn't have to raise his head. The iron sights were mounted directly on the barrel. He could press his face so hard into the wooden stock that his cheek was almost touching the metal. He could bury his body in the drift so deep that only the top 2 inches of his hat and the tip of his barrel were visible. To Soviet observers scanning the tree line with binoculars, he was just another lump of snow in a field of a billion lumps of snow. He offered them nothing to see. As the days turned into weeks, the hunt became a routine of terrifying efficiency. Simo would wake up well before dawn, eat a breakfast of hard bread and dry meat, pack his gear. He carried as little as possible to stay light. No heavy radio, no walkie spotting scope, just his rifle, his cleaning kit, and as much ammunition as he could carry. He would move in a position while it was still pitch black, skiing silently through the backwoods to find a spot overlooking Soviet lines. He never used the same spot twice in a row. He knew the enemy was learning, mapping the locations of his kills, trying to triangulate his position. So he kept moving, drifting like smoke along the column front. The Soviet soldiers began to develop a specific kind of neurosis. They called it fear of the forest. It wasn't fear of battle. It was fear of the invisible. A soldier would be walking to the latrine, thinking he was safe behind the lines, and suddenly drop dead. An officer would light a cigarette, the flame illuminating his face for a second, and that second would be his last. Simo wasn't just killing men. He was killing the chain of command. He prioritized officers, the men waving their arms, the men looking at maps. He knew that if he killed the brain, the body would stumble. The numbers began to climb at a rate that seemed impossible. 10 kills, 20, 50, 100. In a single day, Simo was credited with 25 confirmed kills. The Finnish command started keeping track, verifying body counts with spotters and infantry reports. They realized this small farmer wasn't just defending a sector. He was holding an entire flank by himself. The morale of Finnish troops skyrocketed. They started telling stories about him in the dugouts. They said he was a spirit, that bullets passed right through him. They called him the White Death, a name that drifted across the lines and settled into the minds of Soviet conscripts like a curse. The Soviet response changed from annoyance to panic. At first, they thought they were facing a platoon of snipers. They couldn't believe one man could cover that much ground or kill that many people. They sent out patrols to find the nest. These patrols would wander into the woods, heavy-footed and loud, crashing through underbrush. Simo would watch them come. He wouldn't shoot the first man. He would wait until they were deep in the trap. Then he would take out the leader, then the radio man. Then he would pick off survivors as they tried to run in deep snow. The patrols didn't come back. When patrols failed, the Soviets turned to technology. They brought up heavy artillery. They didn't have a grid coordinate for Simo, so they simply started erasing the geography. They would pick a patch of forest where they thought he might be and unleash a firestorm of high-explosive shells. They shattered trees, turned snow black with soot, turned earth into mud. Simo would lie in his hole, the ground bouncing him into the air with every explosion, shrapnel whizzing over his head like angry hornets. He didn't run. He knew artillery was a weapon of probability. Unless a shell landed right on top of him, he was safe as long as he stayed low. He would wait for the barrage to lift, shake the dirt off his rifle, and go back to work. The escalation reached a breaking point in late January. The Soviet commanders were furious. Their advance had stalled. Their men were terrified to lift their heads above the trench line. The mighty Red Army was being pinned down by a ghost. They decided that if they couldn't blow him up and couldn't find him with patrols, they would send someone who could play his game. They sent a counter-sniper. This wasn't a conscript with a rifle. This was a professional, a killer trained in Soviet sniper schools. He arrived at the front with the best equipment the Soviet Union could provide. A custom-tuned Mosin-Nagant topped with a high-power PU scope, specialized camouflage, a spotter. His orders were simple: find the White Death and kill him. Do not come back until it is done. Simo knew he was being hunted. He could feel the change in the rhythm of the battlefield. The random fire stopped. The careless exposure of enemy soldiers stopped. The Soviet lines went quiet. It was the silence of a predator entering the room. Simo stopped shooting at easy targets. He knew that if he fired at a grunt, the muzzle flash would give the enemy sniper the clue he needed. He went into deep freeze. He lay in his position for hours, not moving a muscle, his eyes scanning the tree line opposite him. He wasn't looking for a man. He was looking for a mistake. The duel lasted for days. It was chess played with bullets across a frozen wasteland. The Soviet sniper was good. He moved carefully, stayed low, used the sun to his advantage. He killed several Finnish soldiers, trying to bait Simo into returning fire. But Simo didn't bite. He waited. He knew that eventually the enemy's reliance on technology would be his undoing. The Soviet sniper had a scope, and a scope needs light. To see through it, you have to position yourself where the sun illuminates the target. And eventually, the sun would move. It happened late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long golden rays across the snow. Simo was watching a pile of logs about 400 yards away. It was a perfect sniper hide. Cover, elevation, good field of view. Exactly the kind of place a textbook sniper would choose. Simo stared at it with his naked eyes. He didn't need magnification. He needed patience. Then he saw it. A tiny, momentary flash of light. Not a muzzle flash. Sharper, brighter. The sun hitting a curved piece of glass. The Soviet sniper had turned his rifle slightly to scan the woods. The light had caught the lens of his scope. That single glint was all the information Simo needed. It told him exactly where the enemy was. Exactly where the head was located behind that glass. Simo didn't hesitate. He didn't have a scope to adjust. He didn't have to worry about the sun reflecting off his own weapon because he had iron sights. He raised his rifle, buried his cheek into the stock, placed the small metal post of his front sight right on the spot where the glint had appeared. He accounted for drop, accounted for wind. He squeezed the trigger. The shot broke the silence of the afternoon. A single flat crack that rolled across the valley. There was no return fire. The glint disappeared. The Soviet counter-sniper was dead, killed by the reflection of his own superior technology. Simo lowered his rifle and ate another handful of snow. The game was over, but the war was just getting started, and the Red Army had thousands of men left to throw into the meat grinder. The arrival of the Soviet counter-sniper had changed the physics of the Kala River front. Before his appearance, the battlefield had been Simo's hunting ground, a place where he moved with impunity while the enemy cowered in trenches. But this new adversary was different. He didn't panic. He didn't spray machine gun fire at shadows. He carved out a zone of silence in the forest, a dead space where any Finnish soldier who raised his head simply ceased to exist. On the morning of January 30th, a Finnish runner carrying mail to the front line was struck in the neck at 400 yards. The shot was perfect, surgical, silent. An hour later, a sergeant peering through binoculars was hit in the eye. The message was clear. The Red Army had stopped playing defense. They'd sent a wolf to kill the wolf. Simo lay in his snowdrift, his body pressed so deep into the powder that he was practically underground. He knew the other sniper was watching. He could feel the weight of optics scanning the tree line, looking for the slightest anomaly. This was the trap the experts had warned him about. They'd told him iron sights were suicide in a duel because he couldn't see the enemy well enough to shoot first. They claimed that without magnification, he was blind against a man who could count the stitches on his collar. But Simo understood something about optics that the experts ignored. A scope gives you tunnel vision. When you look through a tube, you see the world in a narrow circle. You lose peripheral vision. You lose the ability to sense the movement of the forest. The Soviet sniper was looking at the world through a straw, while Simo was watching the whole picture with his naked eyes. The duel stretched into the afternoon, a slow-motion agony of freezing limbs and mental endurance. The temperature dropped to 45 below zero. At this temperature, the human mind starts to hallucinate. Shadows between trees start to look like running men. The sound of wind starts to sound like whispers. Simo fought the urge to move, fought the urge to shiver. He used a mental trick he'd learned hunting moose. He slowed his heart rate down, breathing in shallow, controlled sips of air, swallowing snow to kill the steam. He was waiting for the sun. He knew the Soviet sniper was positioned to the east, facing west into the setting sun. It was a tactical error born of arrogance. The Soviet shooter wanted the sun at his back in the morning, but he hadn't moved when the day turned. Now the light was shifting. The sun began to dip toward the tree line, casting long golden rays across the frozen lake. It was the golden hour, the time when shadows stretch and light becomes directional. Simo scanned the opposite ridge. He wasn't looking for a man, wasn't looking for a uniform. He was looking for the mistake. He scanned the heavy logs of a fallen pine tree, a perfect natural barricade offering cover and a firing lane. Exactly the kind of spot a textbook sniper would choose. Secure, elevated, comfortable. And that comfort was the enemy's undoing. Then it happened. A flash. It lasted less than a tenth of a second. A tiny, piercing spark of light that cut through the gloom of the forest. Not a muzzle flash. Sharper, cleaner. The sun hitting the curved lens of the PU scope. The Soviet sniper had shifted his rifle, turning just a fraction of an inch to scan a new sector. In doing so, he'd caught the sun. That single glint was a lighthouse beam in the dark. It gave away his position with absolute mathematical precision. The technology that was supposed to make him superior had just betrayed him. He was hiding behind a billboard that said, "I am here." Simo didn't rush. Rushing creates tension, and tension ruins aim. He slowly adjusted his elbows, digging them deeper into the ice shelf he'd built. He aligned the Mosin Nagant. The iron sights were black, crisp, stark against the white snow. He didn't have to fiddle with focus rings. Didn't have to worry about eye relief or parallax errors. He just lined up the metal post with the spot where the light had flashed. The distance was 450 yards. The bullet, a 7.62 millimeters projectile, would drop roughly 30 inches at that range. Simo raised the front post slightly, aiming just above the log. He trusted the rifle. He trusted the cold steel. He squeezed the trigger. The shot broke the silence like a whip crack. The rifle bucked into Simo's shoulder, the recoil absorbed by heavy layers of wool. Downrange, there was no dramatic flailing. No scream. The glint simply vanished. The Soviet sniper, hit in the face by a bullet he never saw, slumped backward into his hole. The duel was over. The man with the peasant rifle had beaten the man with the precision instrument because he understood the environment better than he understood the manual. But the death of the sniper didn't stop the Red Army. It enraged them. The Soviet commanders, realizing their specialist had failed, reverted to their primary tactic, brute force. They decided that if they couldn't snipe Simo, they would trample him. They ordered a general advance. A battalion of infantry, supported by heavy machine guns, surged out of the tree line. They were coming for the ridge, coming to bury the White Death under a mountain of bodies. This was the moment where the legend of Simo Häyhä went from a story about sniping to a story about slaughter. A standard sniper shoots and moves, takes one shot, then relocates to avoid being pinned down. Simo didn't move. He knew that if he retreated, the line would break. He stayed in his frozen hole. As the wave of brown uniforms washed toward him, he began to fire with a rhythm that defied belief. The Mosin Nagant is a bolt-action rifle. It's slow. It requires physical effort to cycle. But Simo worked the bolt with a speed that made it sound like a machine. He wasn't shooting randomly. He was dissecting the attack. He shot the officer, blowing the whistle first. The man dropped, his whistle silenced mid-shriek. Then Simo shot the sergeant, trying to rally the squad. Then the radio operator. He was systematically removing the brain of the attack, leaving the muscle confused and directionless. The Soviet soldiers, leaderless and terrified, began to bunch up. They dove for cover behind rocks and trees, pinning themselves down. They couldn't see where the fire was coming from because Simo's ice slab trick was working perfectly. No das cloth, no musliflas, just men dying in the snow. The Soviets tried to suppress him with volume. A Maxim machine gun crew set up on the edge of the clearing, pouring thousands of rounds into the general area of Simo's drift. The bullets chewed up trees above his head, raining pine needles, and barked down on him. Simo didn't flinch. He waited for the gunner to pause for a reload. In that 3-second window of silence, Simo popped up, aligned his sights, and put a bullet through the gunner's helmet. The machine gun fell silent. A second soldier tried to man the gun. Simo shot him before he could touch the trigger. The heavy weapon, the pride of the Soviet infantry, sat useless in the snow because nobody was brave enough to go near it. The cold was now an ally. As the battle raged, the temperature dropped even further. Soviet rifles clogged with cheap oil began to jam. Semi-automatic Tokarevs froze solid. But Simo's bolt action, stripped of all oil and run completely dry, kept cycling. The metal was cold, but it moved freely. He was fighting with a primitive tool that was immune to the elements. He reloaded with stripper clips, his fingers moving by muscle memory, never taking his eyes off the kill zone. He was stacking bodies in the clearing like cordwood. 10, 20, 30. The snow in front of the Soviet line was turning black with the sheer volume of casualties. The psychological toll on the enemy was devastating. They were fighting a ghost. They would sprint from one tree to another, thinking they were safe, only to be hit mid-stride. Simo was leading his targets perfectly, accounting for their movement, firing into the empty space where they would be a split second later. It was marksmanship that bordered on the supernatural. The Soviet soldiers began to refuse orders. They stayed in their holes, hugging the ground, paralyzed by fear of the White Death. The attack, which had started with a roar, was whimpering out into a stalemate. But the sheer number of enemies was the problem. They had unlimited reserves. As one wave broke, another formed behind it. They began to crawl forward, using the bodies of their own dead as sandbags. They were getting closer. 200 yards. 150. Simo could see their faces now, see the fear in their eyes. He was running low on ammunition. He'd fired over 80 rounds in 2 hours. His shoulder was bruised black and blue from the recoil. His right eye was swollen from squinting against the snow glare. He switched tactics. When the enemy got within 100 yards, the sniper rifle became too slow. Simo reached down into his snowdrift and pulled out his secondary weapon, a Suomi KP/31 submachine gun. If the Mosin-Nagant was his scalpel, the Suomi was his chainsaw. It was a heavy drum-fed beast that fired 9mm rounds at a rate of 900 rounds per minute. The perfect tool for close-quarters extermination. He waited until a squad of Soviet infantry made a dash for a cluster of rocks just 80 yards away. They thought they'd finally close the gap, thought they were under the minimum range of the sniper. Simo rose slightly from his hole, the submachine gun tucked tight against his side. He didn't aim with sights. He aimed with instinct, spraying a stream of lead across the front of the charge. The Suomi roared, a buzzing saw sound that ripped through the winter air. The squad was cut down in seconds. The survivors scrambled back, horrified. The sniper wasn't just a sniper. He was a machine gun nest. He was a platoon. He was everywhere. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into twilight gloom. The shooting tapered off. The Soviets, broken and bloody, pulled back to their lines. They left behind a field of carnage that looked like a massacre. Simo sat in his hole, surrounded by empty brass casings. He was shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash and the hypothermia creeping into his bones. He checked his ammo pouches. He was almost empty. He grabbed a handful of snow and shoved it into his mouth, his throat parched from cordite smoke. He'd held the line. He'd won the duel. He'd broken the assault. But as he looked out over the darkened forest, he saw the flicker of headlights in the distance. Trucks. More trucks. The Red Army wasn't leaving. They were just reloading, bringing up more men, more guns, more hate. Simo racked the bolt of his rifle one last time, checking the chamber. It was empty. He loaded his last clip. The day was over, but the night was just beginning. And in the dark, iron sights were harder to use. The odds were getting worse. The White Death had survived the day, but the war was closing in on him. He slid back down into the snow, listening to the engines of the enemy, and prepared to die. The luck of a frontline soldier is a finite resource, like water in a canteen or ammunition in a pouch. You can ration it. You can be careful with it. But eventually, if you stay in a fire long enough, the bottle runs dry. By the first week of March 1940, Simo Häyhä had been fighting on the Kala front for 98 days. He'd survived artillery barges that turned the forest into a moonscape. He'd won duels against the best snipers the Soviet Union could produce. He'd killed over 500 men. But the Red Army was not stopping. They were pushing harder, throwing entire divisions into the meat grinder to break the stubborn Finnish line. The battles were no longer surgical sniper hunts. They were chaotic, close-quarters brawls where the enemy was everywhere at once. On the morning of March 6th, the Soviets launched a massive assault on the Yelizma swamp. It wasn't a tactical probe. It was a tidal wave. They sent waves of infantry supported by heavy armor, trying to overrun Finnish positions through sheer weight of numbers. Simo was right in the middle of it. He wasn't hiding in a snowdrift picking off officers anymore. He was fighting for his life with his submachine gun, cutting down attackers at point-blank range. The air was thick with lead. It was a storm of metal where skill mattered less than blind chance. Simo dropped a Soviet soldier, charging him with a bayonet, but he didn't see the sniper waiting in the trees behind the assault wave. The bullet that found him wasn't a standard rifle round. It was an explosive bullet designed to detonate on impact. It struck Simo in the lower left jaw. The physics of the impact were catastrophic. The bullet didn't just pass through. It exploded, shattering his jawbone and tearing away nearly half of his face. The force of the blow knocked him unconscious instantly, dropping him into the blood-stained snow. To the soldiers around him, he looked dead. He was piled onto a sled with other casualties, a broken, bleeding form indistinguishable from the corpses of the men he'd fought alongside. The legend of the White Death seemed to have ended in the red slush of a swamp. But Simo Häyhä was as stubborn in death as he was in life. A fellow soldier noticed his leg twitching on the pile of bodies. They realized he was still breathing. They rushed him to a field hospital, a chaotic tent filled with the screams of the dying. The doctors who looked at him were horrified. One of them wrote in his report that Simo was missing half his head. They did what they could to stabilize him, stitching the ruined flesh back together, but they didn't expect him to survive the night. He slipped into a deep coma, his body fighting a silent war against shock and blood loss. While the war outside continued to rage, Simo drifted in the dark. He woke up exactly 1 week later, March 13th. The silence in the hospital ward was heavy. The artillery had stopped. The gunfire had stopped. Simo opened his remaining eye and looked at the nurse. She told him the news. The war was over. Finland and the Soviet Union had signed a peace treaty that very morning. The man who had defined the Winter War had regained consciousness on the exact day the fighting ended. It was as if he'd done his shift, held the line until the job was done, then checked out the moment he wasn't needed anymore. The numbers that emerged after the war were staggering. In fewer than 100 days of combat, Simo Häyhä had confirmed 505 kills. That's an average of 5 kills every single day in 40-degree below zero weather with fewer than 4 hours of daylight. It's a statistic that defies logic. Most snipers in modern warfare train for years to get a dozen kills. Simo had deleted an entire battalion, and he'd done it all without a scope. He'd done it with a rifle that most modern experts would consider obsolete junk. He proved that the most dangerous component of a weapon system isn't the optic or the trigger. It's the man holding it. The Soviet Union never officially acknowledged the terror he caused, but their actions spoke louder than any report. They'd carpet-bombed forests just to kill him. They'd sent their best counter-snipers to hunt him. They'd nicknamed him deadliest, the White Death. He was the boogeyman of the Red Army. A ghost story that officers told their men to keep them from lighting cigarettes in the dark. Even after the war, the Soviets demanded that the Finnish government locate him, convinced he was leading a secret army. They couldn't believe that one small farmer had caused that much damage. Simo's life after the war was a stark contrast to the violence of the front. His face was permanently disfigured. He underwent 26 surgeries to repair his jaw, but he never looked the same. The scars were a map of the price he'd paid. He retreated to a quiet farm in Ruokolodi, far away from the cities and the fame. He didn't write books, didn't go on speaking tours, didn't brag in bars about the men he'd killed. He lived alone, raising dogs and hunting moose in the same forest where he'd once hunted men. He became a successful moose hunter, once even hunting with the president of Finland. When people asked him about the war, he was famously brief. He didn't talk about tactics or glory. When asked how he became such a good shooter, he simply said, practice. When asked if he regretted killing so many people, he said, I only did what I was told to do, as well as I could. There was no ego in him. He viewed his service not as a heroic adventure, but as a job. The Soviets had come to his home uninvited, and he'd removed them. It was as simple as clearing rocks from a field or chopping wood for winter. It was necessary work, and he did it with the tools he had. The legacy of Simo Häyhä is a warning about the trap of technology. Today, armies rely on thermal scopes and ballistic computers, often forgetting that batteries die and glass breaks. Simo proved that the simplest tool is often the deadliest because there's less to go wrong. He stripped away the crutches, the optics, the comfort, the safety, and relied solely on his eyes and his patience. He showed history that you can't buy victory with better gear. You have to earn it with suffering. If you go to the military museum in Helsinki today, his rifle looks like a toy, scratched wood and dull metal sitting in a glass case. Most people walk past it without realizing they're looking at the instrument of the White Death. It stands as silent proof that the advantage doesn't come from having more. It comes from needing less. Sometimes the most dangerous thing on the battlefield isn't the equipment. It's simply a man who knows exactly what he's doing and refuses to quit. We're digging through the archives to find more moments where the underdog changed history. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, hit that like button and subscribe for the next deep dive. And tell us in the comments, what's another example of low-tech beating high-tech in history? We read every single one. Thank you for watching.